Alrighty, so for the next episode of the Sales Sleuth Podcast, I'm joined by Gentry Chidester, a colleague of Ben from the previous episode. He handles the sales side, so all the things that people think are weird and they're just very talkative and will say whatever the hell they can say so they can get a client. He's the one that handles the leads that come through from marketing. So I thought it would be an interesting chat to have you on board, Gentry, to talk about the sales side of how you guys work over at Elite, because there is this weird animosity between marketing and sales, like one versus the other, and who's better and who's to blame when the deal doesn't close and all this random stuff. But there's a lot more movement now for the two to sort of integrate with each other and work together. So I'd like for you to do a quick introduction while I light up my pipe like the weirdo that I am, and give us a quick overview of what you do over at Elite Closers.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate it. I'm glad to be on with you, Dylan. So, I'm Gentry Chidester. I'm the CEO of Elite Closers, which is a sales training, sales team building, and recruiting program. So I build 7-8-figure sales teams, and then I find, train, and recruit people who are either in the sales industry or are trying to get in the sales industry, and specifically wanting to get into the remote sales industry. So I've been in sales, I feel like all my life, since I was a young kid. In school, they don't really talk about sales being a profession, but I really think if they had, I would have leaned towards it a lot. I've always loved talking to people. So found myself in sales. I've done door-to-door. I've done cold calling. I've done, inbound call centers, you name it. So found remote closing, which is what I really help people do now, which you just deal with more inbound leads. And then I've been in it ever since. I've sold a little over $50 million in the past 5 years online, selling programs and packages from $2,000 to $250,000 plus. So it's been a journey. I've been through it all, but I'm excited to be here and talk more about it for sure.
Cool. So, like I said, had the conversation with Ben, right? And he thought that you would be an interesting person to chat to since you handle the people that he brings in from the marketing perspective, right? So, on the topic of how sales and marketing and guys need to interact, part of what I want to do with these episodes is give salespeople sort of an idea of what they need to look for before they even consider going into a new offer. Because I've been in bad offers where there's no marketing in place. It's sort of just, here's a lead, talk to them, they said they're interested. And then it's a nightmare because they don't know what the hell they're getting a call about, right? So part of that is what I want to educate. And you guys have a really good relationship between what Elite does, Elite 360, and what you guys do from a sales perspective, because you obviously train people up to these types of things. So on that note, when you guys are thinking about working with someone from a market, like from an offer perspective, what is it that you'll typically look for in a company before saying, yes, let's place somebody there to go work? What are sort of the top 3 or top 5 things that you assess before even considering working with someone?
Yeah, the number one thing, you have to look at the entrepreneur or the business owner themselves and the type of leader that they are, and also the expectations that they have behind bringing on someone for sales, right? And Dylan, you've already mentioned it. A lot of people think sales is just the call, if you will, right? But sales really starts, and you already hit on it, from the marketing side first, from ads to messaging to application questions. So first you look at the entrepreneur, the leadership and expectations that entrepreneur has. And then the second thing that I'm really looking at is the infrastructure of communication channels, right? So are they just having, and what are they considering a lead? That's what I think is so funny. A lot of people, when I tell them I do remote closing, they're like, well, what is it? I'm like, well, you're going to do it from home and you have people who request calls with you. And they're like, oh, well, I've had people request appointments with me, but someone who just sends you a message on Instagram and says, hey, can we talk, is different from someone who watches let's just, for the sake of argument, watches a 30-minute or a 10-minute VSL and then goes on your website and watches all your testimonials and watches 2-3 hours of content before booking a call. They can both request calls, but one person is a lot more indoctrinated than the other. So people need to understand what an actual lead is versus just a random stranger reaching out.
Yeah. So again, you're probably going to run into some arguments when you speak to someone that says, no, but I've got leads, right? They landed on my website. Awesome. What makes that person a lead specifically for you guys? Because this is also an interesting discussion when it goes from something like selling a program, which is a set thing, everyone gets to the same thing, versus a service in B2B. Because this is also an interesting chat I had with Ben, was how does that lead get handled differently when they translate from marketing into sales? Because a B2B lead, when it's a done for you service, is slightly different because they get a different service from each customer. The framework's the same, but it's not a program. So how do you sort of change that discussion when somebody comes in from a marketing perspective and they're more of a B2B lead? Do you change your conversation anyway, or is it more the same, just different product effectively?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. It just depends, obviously, on what the product is. The conversation doesn't necessarily change. What changes is the time frame and the response time that you have to hit that lead in, right? A B2B lead is not going to sit around 3 days waiting for a response. And that's a big thing that I find with a lot of companies I work with is they'll come to me like, oh, I have 12,000 leads that started last year when I started running ads. And the reality is last year's people might not even be on that platform anymore, let alone still answering your message. So I would say what changes the most rather than what is being said is the time of when you need to say it and how quick you need to respond ultimately.
Right. Okay. So I want to explore a little bit about the sort of assessments that you do when you go work for a company. So again, you mentioned doing a little bit of research on the entrepreneur, sort of what their funnel effectively looks like. What do you do if somebody says that they're not open to sharing that type of stuff? Because I've been in a few interviews with people as a sales guy, and they're like, nope, can't show you that. Sorry, it's confidential. And to me, that sends up red flags, is you can't show me how these leads are coming through. But what do you do if you're faced in a situation like that where it's a big name or they're a well-known person, but they can't really show you the track record in terms of your assessment time?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I agree with you in the sense that if someone's not open to sharing their books or sharing some of their infrastructure, it usually is a bad sign. But there have been companies who do have, NDAs in place where they're not at liberty to share. So the second thing I would do is then talk to their team, right? And funny enough, I've actually had some instances where companies have come to me looking for sales reps and are like, well, we just had 2 sales reps leave. And I'm like, well, why did they leave? And they're like, oh, they're lazy. They're not, they just weren't performing. So then I go find the sales rep, and then the sales rep is saying they weren't getting any calls, or the no-show rate is at 90%. So if I can't look at the infrastructure, I find the people who have been around the infrastructure or have currently come and gone or are currently there, and ask them what they're seeing, because they're the ones who are in the trenches. And that's probably where some of this discussion will go, is when you have marketers, sometimes they're like, well, everything's working. The sales team's just thinking, and then the sales team's thinking.
They're not converting these market qualified leads that we send them.
Right. And so it's different when you're actually in the trenches versus standing over the trenches. And that sometimes is the disconnect with marketing and sales.
Okay. So let's talk about those kinds of things that you look for as big red flags. Because again, it's easy for the salesperson to get used. A friend of mine has an expression that says you can lie to a salesperson and still go to heaven. And this is a thing that happens when people are looking to recruit salespeople. Right? Everybody is doing great and everybody's hitting quota and everyone's making $2 million in on-target earnings. And then you get there and everyone's miserable and they hate their life and they'd much rather just go live under a bridge and never talk to another person ever again. So when you're assessing this type of thing, what are the sort of key things that you're assessing tools-wise? And also what would be a good place to go into if they have a team? How many people need to be hitting quota and what do they need to be earning? What are those sort of at least baseline level things that you would look at before even placing a salesperson somewhere?
Yeah, that's a good question. First thing that I look at is ultimately the revenue of the business and then how much the business is offering me. So one of the biggest lies, going down that track that I see is you'll have a business that's doing $25K a month. And then they'll be like, oh, I need a sales rep. And if I get a rep, I can get more calls. But the reality is if you could get more calls, you would already have them. Right. And so bringing in a sales rep actually doesn't get you more calls. Pushing harder on marketing gets you more calls.
Yeah.
And there are instances where some people have had slowed down marketing. But the problem is once you start ramping marketing up, There's going to be other things that break within the marketing, lead quality, no-show percentages, those types of things. So first thing I look at is revenue. If a company's offering 10% of sales, the company needs to be at least 50K or above, would be the first thing. The second thing is the KPIs, right? That the company, if a company comes to me and doesn't have KPIs or doesn't know their KPIs across the board, especially if they've had a team before, that tells me that they don't have any infrastructure, that they probably had sales reps coming and going, which is ultimately why they're hiring. And then the third thing is just basic infrastructure, sales scripts, tracking sheets. Do they have their CRM in place where, something like Elite 360 comes into play? If they don't have those things, I stay away from them pretty far, just because those things take time. They take time to get in place. They require effort. And usually if a business doesn't have that, they're hiring you hoping that you come in and solve that problem.
I've been that guy
for them, and that's not gonna ultimately, especially if you're in a commission-based role, get you paid. So, and again, it's not saying you can't help the company, but what I see is a lot is guys like yourself who seem to be good, honest dudes who get in offers and then end up getting taken advantage of, and then you end up
hamstrung.
you get strung out, and by the time you strung out, you got paid 10% commission on 3 calls, but you did 100 hours worth of work. So those are the main things I look for.
Okay. On the KPI side, right? Because again, each business can lie and say, oh no, we've got like 100 calls coming in. I've been in this situation where the guy's like, no, the owner comes in, I'm closing all the deals and all these people are ready to buy. You just need to show them the pitch. And then you get into the calls and the people don't know their arse on their elbow about what it is that you're doing for these type of people. So KPI tracking wise, you've mentioned things like no-show rates and sort of tracking sheets and those types of things. So what is a good set of KPIs to ask about when you're going into a role? What type of KPIs would you say are crucial to track? And tracking them, if they can say we've got 100 book calls and a 30% no-show rate, those types of things. What are those KPIs that you look for, and what's the baseline at the very least?
Yeah, so it will obviously depend a little bit on the company, right? But first KPI I look at is the closing percentage that they want, right? You have people come in and say that they're closing all these calls, but then you're like, okay, well, what's your closing percentage? And then they don't really know, right? And so that's one. Second thing, which isn't necessarily KPI, but I ask for recorded calls, right? If they don't have recorded calls, then again, they don't have much to back up what they're claiming. Third thing is then cash collected, right? What do they want my cash collected to be? Or what is their average cash collected typically from a sales rep? If they don't know those things, they actually, and especially if they're offering you commission-based role, they don't really know how much you're going to get paid or really caring about it at that point. So those would be my 3 things: your closing percentage, average cash collected, and then recorded calls is not necessarily a KPI, but having those and being able to listen to the person that you're trying to sell. Because again, understanding the offer is important, but equally important is understanding the person you're selling to, which something you just said, right? Is if you're talking to people who don't know anything, or they say are warm leads, but they're getting on and don't know up from down, you're in trouble. So those are the 3 things I have to identify before I would even consider an offer.
Okay. And infrastructure-wise, you also mentioned things like CRM, because I've, again, been in a scenario where there has been one, and there's been really good sort of workflows in place, and the people that came through had watched a 30-minute VSL or something along those lines, all the way through to the other end where there was an Excel sheet as a CRM and no Calendly booking link, and just talk to people kind of approach. So when you're looking at infrastructure-wise, because this is not really something that you can go search unless you use something like Apollo, maybe. They can have a rough idea of what technology the companies are using. But when you're looking at infrastructure, what is the very least sort of bare bones thing that would make a salesperson successful in an offer? Let's say that they have all the KPIs, but you need to know what infrastructure they have in place. What are those things that you think are important for someone to look to?
There's a lot, right? But you mentioned the top one is having a CRM, tracking leads, knowing where the leads are coming from, actually having data that's being gathered. sales script, you need to have the sales script in place. You can't just go to a business that doesn't know what they're saying to their prospects. Tracking sheets in place, right? Being able to go back on past leads, being able to see past numbers that have been used or performed on. And then ultimately, what the one thing that a lot of people look over is continued education in that sales role. Do we have daily team meetings? Do we have weekly team meetings? Who's managing me? Who's going to be directing me when I have questions? Because again, as a sales rep, that's your role, is to make sales, to do sales, right? It's not to be an entrepreneur within the business per se. So if you don't have anyone to guide you or manage you, that's where I see a huge downfall, where people get disconnected. They're trying to figure out things on their own. So that was some key infrastructure and some key logistics, I would say, I'm looking for when I look at a business, definitely.
Okay. So also, now this question needs to be a little bit more in line with the business owner looking for a salesperson. So when they're looking to hire someone, when is the right time, you feel, for a business to say, cool, I'm the owner, I'm done with doing the sales calls, I now need to bring in a team? At what point does a business need to start consider doing that type of thing, like hiring someone like Elite Closers, for example, to say, here's a team, we'll manage them? What stage does a business need to be in to start considering that even? Yeah,
so the way I work it out is companies need to be at least $50K a month cash collected or above. If they're not above that, you typically don't have the number of calls necessary to sustain a full-time closer, full-time sales rep. Again, some of the infrastructure things that we've talked about, they need to have a sales script in place. They need to have a CRM in place. They need to be prepared. And this is a big mistake business owners make. They think they're going to hire someone for sales and never think about it again. All that happens is you end up managing it when you're at that level of $50K a month. Now, if your company's at $1 million a month, you probably have a sales manager who can handle that role for you, right? So it obviously depends on where the business is at. But if we're talking like bare bones, bare minimum, what have I seen after working with hundreds and hundreds of teams? What have the most successful teams done? They're all usually around that $50K a month threshold or above. And again, I just base it off, if you're hiring someone full-time, you're paying them a 10% commission, which that's where a sales rep should be. The biggest downfall I see from business owners is they give sales reps 25% when their company's making $25,000 a month, which is a quarter of the business, right? So that's typically the bare minimum threshold. And then obviously above that, usually the business is a little bit more packed together and has a little bit more infrastructure typically built into play.
Okay. Now, the big question, since you work with Ben and them being the marketing guys, and again, we all know that sales and marketing hates each other. It's written into our contracts as one of the requirements, as the job description is, you need to hate marketing, right? So when you're working with a company, how much communication do you feel there needs to be between the sales team who's taking in these leads and the feedback that needs to be given to the marketing guys so that it can improve? And how would you actually structure that feedback so that it doesn't feel like you're pointing fingers at each other and nobody's winning?
Yeah. I mean, I'll just use my own experiences with working with Ben. I mean, we used to do like a weekly check-in, right? And then what was ending up happening is you're sending Slack messages or you're sending emails back and forth, and nothing is actually changing. You're just, what you said, pointing fingers, complaining. A lot of people are getting upset. So what I see the best teams do is they'll communicate on a daily basis. And again, the more you communicate, the less volume it is, right? So if you do 15 minutes a day, I know that's the cliche thing to say, right? But if you're just consistent, if you're steady in those meetings, you can typically keep pretty good synergy between the sales team and the marketing team. And then the thing is when someone complains, right, it's like, oh, these leads stink. It's then, okay, well, what's your suggestion on how to fix it, rather than just, letting the sales team complain all day long. And then the marketing team just thinking that the sales team's a bunch of babies, right? So the rule of thumb that I've ran is, if you're going to give feedback or say something's wrong, you have to give feedback or a suggestion on what you think could fix it. And then also, just what I have seen is a lot of people in their minds think it's really worse than it actually is. And that's why having good tracking is so important, because you're bound to have a bad day in the marketing side. You're bound to have a bad day in the sales side. So you just need to keep also the wide perspective of things when it comes to, okay, I have, one day where I had 4 no-shows, but then I look at my no-show percentage and it's, less than 10% or less than 15%. In the grand scheme of things, it all works out or should come back together if you're communicating well enough.
Right. Okay. So the next question here is because there's a massive push for people trying to go the remote closer route, right? And I'm chatting to Moose Reed tomorrow, and he's sort of been relatively critical about the whole remote closing thing might be going away a little bit, where there's a bit more of a sort of a hybrid approach where there's a base plus commission and these types of things. So what is your feeling on the future of this type of stuff? Because a lot of big companies went the remote route and now they're going back into office, but coaching packages have been remote for a long time. So how do you see that changing in the next 2 or 3 years as someone that places salespeople at a lot of these types of offers and companies? How do you think that's going to change from a commission-only perspective or a base plus commission kind of vibe? And does it need to be fully remote, or does it need to be hybrid? And where do you see things going in this regard for salespeople going into the remote space?
Yeah, I don't see it going anywhere, to be honest with you. I think all it is a badge, right? I think it's to your comfortability level. So if I have someone who says, well, I don't want to be commission, I want to have base plus commission, I can understand that. But a company that's doing $50 million a year doesn't need to pay a sales rep a base, right? Especially if they're good at sales. So I think, in my personal opinion, sales reps that only take base salaries actually miss out on some of the biggest opportunities, because some of the biggest companies only do commission because they don't need to offer a base. The other thing is, I think, yes, some companies are going back in office, definitely, but I also think companies have seen a huge save from cutting overhead of having an office and haven't seen necessarily a massive decreased workload. And I might be I might be a little biased because I've been remote, the past 5 years. So I haven't seen it go away. And a lot of the companies I work with, besides maybe 2, are all completely remote and haven't mentioned going into an office. Now, I don't disagree or think it's bad. I do also think, though, it limits the amount of opportunities you have to reach sales rep if you want them to come into an office. Now you're just stuck in whatever city you're trying to hire in. So I don't see it going anywhere. I definitely see people have their own opinions and like their own personal preferences, but to say that every team's going to go back into an office, no way. Yeah,
fair point. You also said a really, really, really important thing there, right? A good sales rep or a good salesperson, if they're good. What makes a person a good sales rep? Because that's a very broad topic and means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. Some people just say, as long as they can sell ice to an Eskimo, they're a good sales rep. And then there's the other side of the focus being, can you help the client? So what makes a good salesperson in your view as a guy that places them?
Yeah, the number one thing, in my opinion, that makes the best sales rep is they understand how to active listen to understand. So listening to understand versus listening to respond or listening to come up with the best next thing to say. And again, it's such a basic concept or basic fundamental. And that's one of the biggest things I see with working with reps is I'll have reps come to me and tell me they just read a 1,000-page sales book on all the objections in the world, which is great, but they don't know how to listen, right? And so at the end of the day, it's the basics and foundations that take you the farthest, and then everything else is tools that you can add on that will help you. But if you don't have good base and good foundations, having the best objection techniques in the world aren't ultimately going to help you. So for me, what I really look for and what I find funny is someone who's usually saying I can sell ice to an Eskimo is just listening to themselves talk, and they're saying it about themselves versus the person they're talking to saying it about them. So in my assessment and what I look for with sales reps, and then my best sales reps that I've trained and worked with, they know how to listen the best and be empathetic to what a customer is saying, and then make that conversation be natural and authentic versus just talking to oblivion and having the individual they're talking to just close down on them.
There's also a bit of thinking now around sort of the importance of having frameworks for a salesperson to follow versus being authentic, right? Another guy that I follow, JD Daily, talks about the conversation just being relatively free flowing. When do you think the salesperson needs to do the transition from being new in a role and having very set out frameworks and a process to follow versus being a little bit more, not necessarily winging it, but having some flexibility in how they approach the conversation? So where do you fall on that spectrum? Does the salesperson need to just follow a process to sort of have repeatable results, or does there need to be a shift at some point to a loose framework with a little bit of free flow?
Yeah. My opinion on it is, so scripts are just that. It's a structure to follow. And this is what we were talking about with systems or structures within a business, is that if you can't understand a basic structure, basic system, you actually can't free flow. So a lot of people don't understand a structure or system, so they compensate by saying they're free flowing, when in reality, that just means they don't really know what they're doing. Because when push comes to shove, when someone gets pushed on a call or someone gets in, I'm going to say an elevated conversation in the call, you typically revert back to what you feel safest in, right? And so someone who doesn't know how to actually listen is going to revert back to over talking or talking themselves out of deals. And so the framework is there to be a safeguard. So worst case scenario, you stay within the structures or parameters to keep the conversation moving the way the call is supposed to move, which is forward and ultimately to a decision. So I would say I try to fall right in the middle, which I know is probably not the most entertaining thing to the podcast, but I try to, any sales rep, learn the structure, learn the script, and then add your free flowing, add your personality, your authenticity into it once you learn the system and structure.
Okay. So from that framework standpoint, right, because a lot of people think about this differently. When you're talking, you need to have 5 to 10 minutes of rapport building and then setting the agenda and then pain discovery and then asking for the close, right? Very broad sort of strokes type of thing. So when somebody is planning on bringing in a salesperson in, what do they need to have in terms of that structure for the salesperson to follow to begin off with? What are those sort of key points that they need to be looking towards? And what key points does the salesperson need to ask for to know whether the structure is a good one?
Yeah. So how you know you have a good structure is when you don't win on a call, you understand why you lost it. And that's actually how you get better, is when you don't close a deal, you understand exactly where you lost it in the call, or you understand what you didn't do correctly, and then you have to go practice that. A lot of people lose calls, and the first thing they do is blame the person they were talking to, or again, in your words, they blame the marketing team. And where I started getting a ton better, and really where I started to see my sales career take off, is when I realized 99% of the times I didn't close, it was on me, and then pinpointing it to 5 minutes of the conversation versus the whole hour, right? And that's really what it comes down to. Just like in a sports game, it usually comes down to like 2 or 3 possessions or 2 or 3 minutes in the game where all the momentum shifts, all the energy shifts. Same with the sales call, right? And so that's why breaking it up into a framework is important, because then you can break it into bite-sized pieces and then hyper-focus on the sales rep weak spot. So example, I've worked with people who are amazing at handling objections, but they stink at listening. Well, when you're handling objections, you have to be a smooth talker. You have to know how to get your point across in a way that's easy to understand. So it doesn't require as much listening there, right? Now, it requires listening to understand what objection you're fighting, but typically they're hurting most where you talked about gathering the pain, right? They don't really listen to someone's pain. They say it for them, what have you. So that's why it's important to have a framework. Now, the question of what framework do they need to have in place is dependent solely on the business, right? Now, the more B2C style the offer, the more in depth it needs to go, the more real and empathetic you'll need to get on the call with that individual. The more B2B, typically, the more logical you can keep the conversation and keep it moving forward.
Okay. So on the next point to this, right? There's a big push for the whole networking thing in order to get your roles and these types of things. And as a salesperson, how would you recommend people that is in sales that wants to go and start doing the remote sales thing and not just do sort of go work at a big company and get the base salary where you do the application, all these types of things? How would you recommend a salesperson go about networking without it feeling like you're trying to sell the person on buying a salesperson effectively? What's your recommendation on that approach? Do they go through a placement firm like yours? Do they go their own route and make their own business? What's your thinking on that space?
So it just depends ultimately on what you're looking for, right? So with my company, we guarantee placement. So if you're 100% know this is the route you want to go, you 100% know that you want a spot in a good spot, then you want guaranteed placement, right? If you're just checking it out, if you're not 100% sure, you can go look on LinkedIn or Indeed. But the problem with a lot of the companies that are on there, they're newer, they're starting out. They typically don't have a lot of good infrastructure, which is why they're trying to pull people in for free, ultimately. So it ultimately just depends on what someone's goals are. But I would personally say that what I've seen is some of the best positions are going through recruiting firms like mine, just because they know that they're going to get someone who's fully trained and is ready to get plugged in versus going through 50 applications and hoping you get 1 out of 50.
Okay. So are there any other sort of tips and tricks that you want to lay out there for any other person that's been in the shit in the mire like I've been, where it's been really bad scenarios? What would be your recommendation from an exit strategy standpoint? Do they need to have an opportunity lined up, or do they just need to leave if things start getting really bent out of shape? Because sometimes these things ambush people, right? So it starts off well, and you got a whole bunch of calls, and then it goes dry. What's your recommendation for someone that finds themselves in that scenario?
Yeah, well, I think this has been a bigger thing that's been being talked about, but I think something that is being undervalued is relationships, right? And so sales is a big thing, is it's about relationships. And so if you're with a company and you made a commitment to them, I always encourage even my reps, if that they're wanting to transition out or switch offers, to try to leave on a good note, because a good company will go back to your previous company. At least most of my companies I work with do. So if they go back to a previous company and say, hey, Dylan just didn't even give us the 2 weeks, he just stopped showing up, he stopped responding, it's usually going to come back to hurt you in the long run. I would say, though, if you're unhappy, you need to make a plan to leave, right? And then understand what you're looking for and why your current situation didn't work out, right? So was it the marketing was bad? They didn't have enough leads. What was it? And then the next position you get into, you need to verify that. And if the company won't verify, I would stay away from it for that particular person, because you understand the harm that can come from not verifying those things moving forward in the future.
Right. Okay. So next question, from the marketing perspective, when you're working with the marketing guys, what makes a lead a good lead for you guys? When you get a lead from marketing, let's say they came through from the stuff that Ben and them do, what makes it a good lead for a salesperson to actually get onto a call? Because not all leads are created equal.
Yeah. If I'm going to let my ego speak, it's part of the sales team to help that lead. But from the marketing perspective, what I have found has made the biggest difference is the amount of touch points that we were talking about earlier. The faster you can touch a lead, the more you can touch a lead, the longer you can keep them in your indoctrination process, the more they're going to see what you're doing, and the more that they'll be inept to hear you out or be more open. And again, that's all sales is, right? Are they willing and open to hearing what you're offering and the message? If someone's not open, they can have all the money in the world, but if they're not open to hearing about it or willing to have a conversation with you, it's not going to go anywhere, right? So that's where I have found the biggest difference is when we stepped up the amount of touch points, right? Between when the lead came across the ad or when the lead came across the email to the conversations that started happening, that lead ends up coming on the call with a little bit more established trust than someone who sees an ad, never hears from anyone, and then you call them out of the blue, which, sounds like you've had that experience before. So for me, what has really helped is turning on those touch points and making sure that they're consistent across the board. And that's ultimately what I help a lot of teams do when I end up working with sales teams. They'll come to me and they'll have a 40% no-show rate or 35% no-show rate. And most of the companies I work with carry a 20% or less no-show rate, right? So every 10 calls they get, maybe 2 don't show. But the goal for most of the companies I work with is 15% or lower, which again is 1 out of 10 calls typically don't show. And that's sales. You're just going to have people who won't show up. I mean, happens everywhere. But that's what I would say personally from a marketing, what would make it a good lead is someone that ultimately has a little bit more understanding what they're getting on the call to discuss versus just seeing something that said you've got a free ebook and then they didn't get the ebook, so they want to ask you where their ebook is and then jump off the call. Yeah, okay. Because I had the same conversation with Ben, right? And we kind of explored the whole region of automations and when does the salesperson need to pick up off the automation. So how much of those touch points from a sales side are you guys looking to automate then? And sort of where do you see that going in the future? Because the buyer's journey is getting much longer. People have a lot more access to information, and they really only get to the buying stage much later now, where you would have had to have a conversation with the salesperson before. Yeah, so a big thing for teams that I work with is we try to get calls booked within a 72-hour time period. Right. And then within that 72-hour time period, they'll have 4 automated touch points and then at least 2 personal touch points. So within a 72-hour period, they have 6 touch points. And I will be honest, there's been some times where people feel like that's overkill, or there's been people who say it's too much. But ultimately, those are the same people that show up on the call and haven't watched anything, don't know anything, and are just wanting you to have a 2-hour conversation with them from top to bottom, right? So I try to be overly conservative in sharing information. And, let's say in the last month, right, out of 100 leads, I might have had one get upset about the amount of touch points. But again, I would rather have someone show up over-prepared for a call than under-prepared, ultimately. So typically I split it 4 and 2, 4 automated, 2 personal. You can do more personal if you want, but usually I haven't seen a need to go much further past that. Okay. So touching on the automated stuff versus the personalized thing, what are the things that they need to be receiving from an automated perspective for the lead to get better qualified? Because I imagine that's why you're going the route of having multiple touch points, is that the lead can be more prepared and higher qualified and better educated, right? So from an automation standpoint, what is it that you think a lead needs to see before they even get into a conversation in that 72-hour period? What do you need to be sending through to these people ahead of time? Yeah, so the number one thing, there's a number of things you can do, right? You can automate an email, automated text, ringless voicemail. But the one thing that's automated that a lot of companies I work with don't have is what I would call thank you videos or homework videos, right? Where someone books a call and then you have videos that go out that address all of the objections or the most common objections before the call ever happens, right? Because then the person gets on the call and it's like, well, I had a question about this, but it was kind of answered in the video, right? And if they don't feel satisfied with that answer in the video, they usually reach out to the rep who personally messaged them and was like, hey, can you clarify what I saw here? So you mentioned it, the buying cycle doesn't start till much later, but what happens with a lot of leads I deal with is they get on and they're already farther along that buying cycle because we've already been putting them through the sales process. And that's the problem. If you wait to start selling until your call, you're already starting the call behind. You're already losing. Versus you can start selling before the call. And I think that's what's left out in marketing, right? Marketing is like, we'll get them to the call and then sales team, sell them, right? Where there can be a happy mesh. That there's 100% some of the best salespeople suck at marketing, and some of the best marketers suck at sales. So that's where the happy marriage of, hey, I think we could create automations that sell this way or knock out these types of objections, help in the long run. And then again, by the time the person gets on the phone, they're already, let's say 10, 15, 20% down that sales process, which naturally helps the closer have a little bit easier conversation moving forward in the process.
Okay. And then from the personalized standpoint, because I'm seeing a lot of thinking in the sort of bigger corporate tech sales guys where they're doing more cold email and then cold calls, then referencing the cold email side. There is a manual side to it, and then the automated side, which you just covered. So from the manual side that you spoke about, those two or three manual touch points, what does that look like from a good sort of sales process type of side? So let's say that they've received their four automated points. What's the next steps after that for a sales rep to do?
So it depends again on the company, but if I was working with you, we text them, right? So manual text. And then one that a lot of people don't use is connecting on social media, right? And so if I connect with someone on Instagram before the call and I can see they're married, they have, family, whatever it may be, or I can see that they just traveled to Italy, naturally when we start the conversation, I'm going to have things that I can bring up that get the conversation naturally free flowing, like we were talking about earlier. But what a lot of people don't understand is the second part. If we get off the call and they tell me that they're going to think about it, and then we set a follow-up, and then we're following each other on Instagram, and I see on their Instagram story that they're out with their friends drinking beer and eating chicken wings, and we're supposed to be having a follow-up call, right there, it tells me everything I need to know about the lead, and then I don't waste time continuing to endlessly follow up or convince myself that that person was sold when they really weren't. Right. And that's more rare than it is common, but that's the biggest thing I see with sales reps is they waste time following up with leads that probably shouldn't be followed up with. And then they don't follow up with the leads that they should because they don't get behind the curtains. The way you get behind the curtains in our day and age is through social media. And I just think people massively underuse it as a sales tool. And that's where you can really, if you connect on those platforms, you can see a lot of growth, not only in like closing on the call, but in your follow-ups as well.
And you raise a good point there, right? Is when you should no longer be following up with a lead. So in a commission-only state, right, everyone wants to go the route of, well, every lead is the potential to close, and that means that I'm going to make a little bit of money on the side, so that's great. So I'm going to keep following up endlessly. And I've seen this thinking in a couple of places where you keep following up endlessly. So when do you think a rep should stop following up with the lead? Right, because that sounds like a qualification criteria.
Yeah, so this is a good question I get asked a lot, and so it might sound a little bit counterintuitive, but if you and I are following each other on social media, right, and I post content or I'm posting about what you and I discuss, and you're seeing it, that's a follow up, but it's an unattached follow up, right? It's just a natural, free-flowing, evergreen follow-up until you unfollow me or block me, right? So I can't tell you how many people who I've engaged with on social media don't close on the first call. I follow up with, they read the message, I see that they don't respond, so then I just continue to post content, right, around the discussion or around what we discussed moving forward on, and then they come back like, well, I saw this, and it just gave me the confidence to jump forward. So I at least follow up with people I thought had potential at least once a month, or my rule of thumb is anytime I think about them. So if I'm sitting, watching a movie and I think of someone, I'll either make a note or I'll just shoot them a message and just be genuine in my approach about that and see where it goes. But unless someone, tells me they've gone a different direction or doesn't want me to follow up, I try to stay on leads at least once a month. But again, if I see that I'm sending them messages, they're reading them, it's usually a pretty good sign if they're not responding. I don't need to keep actively, every day, every time, same day of the week, keep sending follow-ups. Like you got to know and learn how to differentiate who's an actual hot follow-up and then who's the ones that you can just kind of put in an evergreen cycle. have some personal touch points, but then also put them in an automated cycle, if that makes sense.
Right. I've also had an interesting conversation with a few people. Will Aitken comes to mind. I should see if I can get him on as well. But he does a lot of the sort of video content side of things when he's talking about the technology that he's selling. So his profile has on LinkedIn, this is now B2B specifically, has a lot of content that's related to his product. So where do you think that healthy line sits? How much of your content, if you're posting on social media, should be related to the product that you're selling? And what's the risk of being pigeonholed into being the person that sells coaching packages, but you've actually moved on to something else, right? So there's a personal branding aspect to that. So how do you see that line between the two if you're talking content posting?
Yeah, if you're worried about that, I typically say you should make a separate Instagram or separate social media with, or even LinkedIn, right? Just dedicated towards that brand or towards that content. And there's ways to separate them. If you don't want to do that, then obviously my rule of thumb is for every, 4 pieces of content I'll post about my brand or about my offer, then I'll post one just natural human about, I pick top 4 things that I enjoy or top 4 things that I'll post, which is typically family, sports, food or travel, or like 4 things outside of business, right? So then I'll just post one of those. That's kind of been my method to my madness. And then also, again, anytime I just feel, hey, you know what, rather than posting about business today, I'm just going to post something personal. Just trying to be authentic and natural rather than, I think one of the downfalls sometimes is, even in sales, you were asking about earlier, like scripts and structures, is at the end of the day, we're dealing with human beings. And I think if you can stay as human as you can in a sales process, it honestly will help you stand out rather than trying to create a perfect formula to pinpoint certain people.
Cool. We have about 5 minutes left. So I want to give you the last 5 minutes, right? Or 5 to 10 minutes. You're obviously running a recruitment agency, and I asked this question to another guy because he does the same thing. He just does it in the B2B space, more specifically in building out CRMs. So in like 2 or 3 years' time, who's the types of people that you want to help regarding this whole sales thing? Because it's a exhausting career. You deal with rejection a lot more than most people do. Some people can make the argument that it's not entirely healthy, but who's the types of people that you would want to help as a person that does sales placements from a business perspective? Who's the clients and who's also the salespeople that you want to work with, right? 2 or 3 years down the line, you've made all the money in the world. You're lying on your deathbed. Hopefully that's not the case. But if you look back at the 3-year point, you can say, I'm really proud to have helped these types of people. Who are those types of people?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know if it's so much a certain type of person or a certain type of people. I think what I want to, if that was the situation, what I would want people to say is that they felt like, if they're a sales rep, that they felt like they found their calling, if you will. That's one thing I feel like sales is and was my calling. I just didn't know it until I fell into it, right? And I think a lot of people don't understand, how great sales can be. I mean, look at us, right? Like we didn't know each other from, up or down, and now we're talking. So the relationships that can be built, I think that's for sales reps and someone who genuinely is trying to find their calling. I would want them to say, like, through me, by working with me, they felt like they found their path in life, and whether they made a ton of money or not, they were happy every day waking up and getting to be in this type of role. As far as businesses, I mean, there's all different types of businesses, but I think businesses ultimately that focus on helping people and also are focused on growth. At the end of the day, a lesson I had to learn a hard way is, if you make $1 million or 10 million, no confetti or champagne falls from the sky and starts, pouring on you. And so just enjoying the journey of the process, kind of what we're talking about, right? Everything to me is a little bit like art. So from the beginning of where the marketing starts to the sales call, my main thing is working with companies who are focused on growth and focused on building a good team and good culture and people who want to do that. I think that's that's what I would be, happy and content with, and feel like that's where we're headed for sure.
Awesome. So, Gentry, where can the people find you? I need to do the call to action thing at the end of the call, like most YouTubers need to do. So, where can people find you, and how should they find you?
Probably easiest two ways. You can find me at my Instagram, so it's just at Gentry Chidester, my name, and then my website. Luckily, is pretty easy. It's just eliteclosers.com. So, website's eliteclosers.com. Pretty easy to find me. Just type it in right to Google or Safari or whatever internet device you have, and I should be there. But that would probably be the easiest way.
Cool. Thank you very much, Gentry. I really appreciated this conversation. Have a good weekend.
Man,
we're almost at the
Thanks
weekend.
for having me.
We're almost at the weekend.
It's
enjoy.
It's always the weekend, right?
Cool,
Appreciate it, Dylan. Thanks, man.
Have a good day.
Okay, you too.